Crisis on Infinite Earths is one of the most important events in DC Comics history, but is it still enjoyable to read today? Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Marv, Wolfman and illustrated by Perez, the first issue of Crisis on Infinite Earths was published by DC Comics in April of 1985, with the 12th and final issue being released in March of 1986. And the multiverse is being destroyed, with planet after planet falling victim to the Anti-Monitor. The remaining heroes from different Earths band together to put a stop to him, and hopefully prevent the end of life as we know it. But what if, in the end, it's just a battle that they can't win? Perez has this timeless quality to his artwork. And I'm probably biased going into this because I did a ton of research from my top 5 notable works that I did on him, so I know the difficulties that they had going into this. And what he does best is have this style that's a perfect blend of classic and modern. This doesn't look like a comic that's nearly 40 years old, but at the same time it doesn't look like something that would be released today. And the one thing that impresses me above everything is just how dynamic he is. From the paneling to the action to the expressions, it's all just got this energy that translates so well, even on those pages that are really dialogue or exposition heavy. But what impressed me specifically about Crisis on Infinite Earths is just his use of energy. I can't think of the actual definition, but it's like characters appearing over Earth, or the effects that were going on in the sky or when you're in space. It really just made me stop and look at exactly what was happening on each page. There were also the big moments and the full page spreads, but I felt like they were used sparingly so that they really had that wow factor. And that was a problem that I had when I reviewed the Sinestro Core War, so it's interesting to see that that wasn't too much of a problem earlier on. And there were some moments where I felt it could have benefited from being a double page spread, but instead it'd just be a panel when it was explaining some kind of massive concept. However, in talking about the paneling, there are some pages where it's just a bit unclear of what the flow of the book should be. There could be a block of panels that are clearly outlined in a box, but the dialogue would be telling you to go somewhere else that didn't really match with the flow. And I'm not sure if that's to do with Perez or Wolfman or whoever was doing the lettering, but it was something that distracted me quite a lot when I was reading this. In some ways though, that is also Perez's greatest strength because he can just contain so much on a single page. But even today, it still just impressed me with how much he can do in a short space of time, which honestly came in handy because with how dense this book is, if Perez didn't do that, this would probably be like a 50 issue series. There was also one issue where there was a second story that was going on at the bottom of the pages, and I can't lie, I glossed over the story, which had this stencil quality that looked different from what was going on in the rest of the page, and it really just helped it pop because it was in black and white. Another great thing about Perez's work is that all of the characters have their iconic look. Even on the pages when there's who knows how many characters are on there, they're all still recognisable. And characters that enter the DC universe through this had their look solidified through Perez. So from that angle, it is great for a new reader because you've got these characters that you know and you can recognise that look and know exactly who they are. And it's something that you can use to recognise them in later events because it's pretty consistent from there. The only major criticism that I've got is that there were some pages that were just missing stuff. It felt like the page hadn't loaded fully, and I know that this was something that was more acceptable during this time, and it does still happen in the modern era, and yes, I am looking at you, House of M, but it was still something that I noticed on multiple occasions, and I can't just sit here and give the art unanimous praise. But there was still this bittersweet vibe that I got when I was looking at the art. Knowing how pretty much the entire industry doubted this event, and Perez just took it in his stride and made one of the most visually impressive books that he did in his career, is just phenomenal. I kinda wish I didn't have to sell the Absolute Edition years ago when I was 18 and I needed money for driving lessons. But if it ever came back in print or you just want to pick up any other books, you can get them from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Now I know I'm going to get some people who are going to absolutely hate what I've got to say in this video, but Crisis on Infinite Earths was an absolute chore to read. There's just so many words, and not even in a creative or necessary way. I genuinely believe that writers must have gotten paid by word count during this era. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against extensive reading. I loved when I went back to The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, but the majority of the writing in this book is just an exposition dump. And that's not me trying to diminish its ambition or the fact that it does feel epic from issue 1. I can't even imagine some of the planning that must have gone into this or being able to comprehend some of those bigger concepts that it had to to explain. So regardless of how I feel about the execution, I don't think there's anybody that could undermine the amount of ambition and creativity that went into this. As well, I have to give it credit for incorporating and trying to balance as many characters that are in here, along with having to incorporate those from the Charlton universe. And that was one thing that I was especially interested in seeing on this reading, because when I first read this when I must have been about 15 or 16, I didn't realise that Blue Beetle and the Question and a number of these other characters weren't a part of the DC universe before this, but I was underwhelmed with how this was handled. I like that they were given time to shine, but in a book that's so explanation heavy, all we really get on this topic is, these are some heroes from a different universe, deal with it. However, the established DC characters were great in this. Superman, both versions really stole the show, and beyond just the basic desire of not wanting to see the multiverse be destroyed, having them in this so often just reminded me of why we want to see the good guys win. Additionally, the majority of the bigger moments in this event had Superman there. When there's a character's death that I'm not really sure why I'm not spoiling here because it's on the very front cover of the majority of the publications of this book, his raw emotion made the stakes just feel more heavy. There's also a moment or two where he just loses his shit and he seems to have a much shorter temper than the modern Superman, and I really like that, and he managed to make me relate to him. It's also like that one grandparent that everybody has that you can't take them anywhere because they're just always going to try and start something. And another thing that I liked from a character perspective is that Batman wasn't front and centre through the whole thing. I'm reading another more modern DC event at the moment to finish off the season of events, and Batman's just there because of the fact that he's pretty much the biggest money spinner for DC Comics. And sure, yeah, he is in Crisis on Infinite Earths, but because this is on a multiversal level, you've got the more power-bound heroes leading the fight. And there was also a really nice moment early on where he was still just chasing after Joker, and I felt like this worked really well because it felt like world building. Not everything needs to be pulled in straight away, you can still have characters going about the usual day-to-day business, and it was just a nice touch that I appreciated. However, some of the characters that really lead this story, like Alexander Luthor, Harbinger, and even the Monitor to a certain extent, I just didn't feel myself getting as invested with them, and that they were taking the spotlight away from other characters, especially because of the fact that they mostly were just the ones doing all the exposition. That's probably the reason why I didn't like them as much. There was also this betrayal plotline that involved some of them, and I won't go too in depth with it to avoid spoilers, but I wasn't shocked when it happened, and I kind of just didn't care. In saying that though, I loved the Anti-Monitor. He was menacing, ruthless, and came very close to doing the mission that he set out to do. I loved his different forms, the fake outs that we had with him, and his ability to just take everyone on. There was this kind of shadow army that I thought was going to be the thing that happens in a lot of modern MCU films, that there is just a faceless horde that they can go against, and then there's just going to be a one-on-one fight against the big bad guy. The Anti-Monitor didn't really have that. He was more than willing to throw down with everyone at the same time, which I kind of respect. I have seen him appear in later titles, but I don't think I've been as entertained as I was with him during Crisis on Infinite Earths, because in modern books it feels like they just include him so that they can go, look, this book must be important, we've got the Anti-Monitor. There was actually an entire issue that centered around the DC Comics villains and how they banded together, and it worked really well and took me by surprise, especially considering one of the points of criticism that I've got later on. It was nice that this was included to service the story that was going on rather than just to try and sell a few other books. However, although there are a lot of character aspects that I really do like, there's just too many of them. This literally has everyone, and even though it tries to give everyone a moment, very few of them get to stand out. And sometimes I do just think that less is more. It is a universe spanning event, I get that, and it is going to affect pretty much every DC character, but it just makes it difficult to root for certain characters or worry about their peril unless it is somebody like Superman or the Flash. In response to that though, I guess that the threat is always the focal point. Sometimes events that are just focused on one character often miss out on a lot of action or development, but Crisis on Infinite Earths doesn't have that because it always keeps the plot as its through line. It never really diverts or strays away, and I guess maybe my criticism that there's too many characters is probably because of the fact that I feel like sometimes they could bog down the plot from moving forward. And yeah, I touched on it before, but a large part of that is the panels and the pages that only exist to try and get you to buy another book, and they very rarely add any context as to why I should care in the first place. I know there's a lot of companion volumes for this event, and there's a reason that I haven't picked them up. And sure, it might feel unfair because this isn't a technique that's unique to Crisis, or even comics of that era, but at least when it's done in other books, it feels like they're doing it because they're referencing something that has a point. But it did happen for a lot of other books as well, to the point where I felt like I should just give up reading this because at one point it's just going to be an advert for everything else that's going on. And for someone who's mostly a fan of DC Comics, post-Crisis on Infinite Earths, I didn't care for a lot of these other worlds. There was a Sergeant Rock one, a Commandy one, and just all the other ones that I've forgotten that had just bogged down this story. I get it, a lot of Earths are dying as a result of this event, but a large majority of the beginning of this story is just heroes going to another Earth, telling them that the planet's gonna die, and then it just dies anyway. It's kind of just pointing, it's going, hey look, we remember that this is a part of DC's history. And at first it was interesting, but when it was happening every couple of pages, it just felt like Groundhog Day. At least in those early issues, there was a lot of setup that did pay off later on, but in all honesty, I couldn't blame a modern reader if they get a couple of issues into this and just wanted to skip a few. So it's a shame, because if you were a massive fan of this story, it probably sounds like I'm just shitting on it and being a dumb guy and saying, oh, this book's old so it must be bad. But I sound pretty dumb regardless of what I say. But I just couldn't get past the fact that no one spoke like a real person. There are so many just bizarre inner monologues, but somehow every character sounds the same. And from the dialogue alone, there's very few distinctions unless somebody's super smart or evil, or in most cases, both. And on top of that, and it is a sign of the times, but the monologues are just mostly pointless. And I think it would have been a fun take if the Bronze Age characters would have had that sensibility where they just kind of over-explain and inner monologue everything, similar to what it was like in comic books during that time. But I do also get that this was before Watchmen, so maybe that was just a technique that just wasn't realised yet. For me, I just know it's not great if I have to take a break during an issue. And especially in the middle part of this story, I had to do that frequently. For some reason, one of the most important issues was double-sized as well, and considering that the cover told me what was going to happen in this issue, I thought it was double-sized because it was going to facilitate that, but nope, it's just an origin story for one of the characters that they introduced in this event. And weirdly, this made me miss one of the parts that most people hate about modern events. If Crisis on Infinite Earths was coming out today, that would have been a one-shot special that you wouldn't necessarily need to read. You wouldn't bog down what was happening in the main series to tell you all about this, especially when it comes at a time in the story when it doesn't really matter. But had this come out as its own issue, I could have skipped it and just got into the meat of the story. There was also another part that I touched on during the art that was following the Monitor's tapes. Might have even been the anti-Monitor's tapes, that's how little attention I paid to it. And I had to gloss over this because it came at a point in the book when the main story was finally starting to kick off, and I just wasn't learning anything or being entertained by it. However, I am glad to say that it does turn the corner and has a belter of a final couple of issues. Every moment built on the one before it, and there was a ton of payoff, but can I say that this saved the overall experience? I'm not too sure on that one, and it's definitely a question that I go back and forth on, but at least it did end with a bang. And that's the thing that I'm finding myself most conflicted on whilst I'm reviewing this, because I had that feeling that this was important and the stakes were high. But is the impact of this event disguising the overall entertainment value? Honestly, I think it does. Even looking at the back of this, it uses words like comics were never the same, unforgettable, defining, make good on its promise of lasting change. But in nowhere does it say that this is entertaining. This almost has the same impact as reading some kind of history textbook, but you know, not that bad, it doesn't feel like you're back in school. Or like having to read Shakespeare if you make the dumb mistake of going for an English degree. Because I know why I need to respect this and why it's important. But its main goal, first and foremost, just seems to be to reset the DC universe, rather than trying to entertain anybody who was reading it. And as a modern reader, and knowing that that was going to be the outcome before I even started the first page, it became so weighed down in that goal and explanation that it often forgot to utilize some of those moments to really thrill the audience. So it is tricky because it had a big mission that it massively succeeded at when it was first coming out. But unfortunately, times do change, and I think if somebody was to read this today, they might have a similar experience. And that's not me saying that this is devoid of any kind of thrilling or memorable moments, but if I wanted to speak about them, I guess I'm going to have to jump into spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict. But I loved that Supergirl's death was still an impactful moment. It's just a shame that during this era, it felt like you had to spoil the ending of an issue on the front cover. Like, why was that a thing? But they gave it the time so that it still felt important today. I don't know a massive amount about Supergirl pre-Crisis, or if she was that popular, but her sacrifice felt monumental. She held her own quite well against the Anti-Monitor, and did so in a way that didn't show up Superman. And just the paneling as she was dying was just done so well. And what's craziest is that the book still managed to give the moment time despite the fact that all these worlds were ending, and we even had a bit of a mourning period. Although that was probably because this issue was twice as long as normal. Batgirl said a piece, Superman had a chance to react to it, and it was just great that this book wasn't afraid of having a moment of pause to solidify what had happened and just how high the stakes were. Similarly, Barry's death still packs a punch, and it's insane that this happens in the issue after Supergirl. feels. I do get the feeling that he was held captive for the majority of this event because of how powerful he is, and he probably could have just ran around and got everything sorted in about one issue, or maybe 5 if Wolfman's scripting it. It was great that the length of time that Barry was held captive also managed to tie into the story, so that he could slowly test himself and see if he could escape, and seize the exact right moment to do that. And it was just nice to see that he did get a chance to punch Psycho Pirate in the face. What I liked best about Barry's death is that it seemed to bring everyone together at the moment when they needed it most. They all also just stepped it up to the next level when I didn't think that that was possible, and it was just an amazing send-off for Barry. It's also just a bit weird for me that when I was getting into single issue comics, Barry was just coming back, so they kept him dead for a while. And for as much as I've bagged on the pacing, the final battle with the Anti-Monitor was just so epic and a great conclusion. It did feel like the entire universe was doing absolutely everything it needed to ensure that something could manage to survive. When you think about great DC villains, people often go for the Joker or Lex Luthor, but I think just because of how powerful the Anti-Monitor is, we often end up leaving him off our lists. Even though coming out of it I might have an overall negative impression of this event and the story that it told, at least it still gave us a great villain. This is my final verdict. And there's no debating that Crisis on Infinite Earths is one of the most important comics that DC has ever published. It will forever have its place in history and still be integral to modern continuity, and I can guarantee that we're still going to classify titles as being pre or post Crisis. But that doesn't give it a free pass forever. I will never fault its ambition, but reading it now nearly 40 years later when comics have developed, unfortunately this just hasn't aged well. The pacing is stuck at a crawl even during its most exciting moments. The dialogue is forced and stilted and just everywhere. It gets bogged down with backstory of characters that I don't really care about because there's just so many that are already in this event. And the excitement that I'm sure must have been there on first release just isn't here now because I know exactly what's going to happen in the end, because the entire universe changed as a result of this. And that's not me saying that it doesn't still have its merits and stuff that people could still enjoy today. The wide range of established characters that we already know and don't need to be introduced to are handled well and all get a bit of the spotlight. The George Perez art still has its complexities that are still rarely seen today, and the Anti-Monitor is a fierce and terrifying villain. There's also memorable moments and unlikely team-ups that meant that this wasn't a bad book, it just wasn't one that scratched that itch for me as a modern reader. Maybe if you have the nostalgia for this title, it's worth revisiting, but if you're somebody who's new to comics, or maybe just new to DC Comics, I really can't give this a recommendation, besides just the fact that it's interesting to see where the modern DC universe started. I know I'm probably going to get some backlash for this rating, or people just calling me dumb, which is really not a secret to anyone, but the question at the beginning of this video was, is it still entertaining if you read this today? And from a purely entertainment value, if I'm being generous, I can't give this higher than 50%. Woof! So that's the video, hopefully you enjoyed it. Until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.